This series discusses crime scenes, details from autopsy and skeletal analysis, discussion of drug use, and references to historic official reports that may use outdated language regarding a variety of social issues, including topics like immigration, housing insecurity, and sex work. Listener discretion is advised. This is the fall line. Share, share, share. It can break a case. We've been hammering that point home this season, that the publicizing of cold cases can solve them. That by participating, you can be the difference between a John or Jane Doe remaining unidentified or a case resolution. Anything. Reposting the flyers that we've made, sharing episodes, finding and sharing news articles, asking your local media to cover a case. It's all incredibly important because it gets the story in front of the right people. This message probably seems repetitive, especially when DNA has become the focus in the news. We tend to forget that many, many cases are solved based on community tips. But just this week, the week that we're recording this episode, that is, the point was proven once again. Close to 5 years ago, we began our coverage of John and Jane Doe cases with 3 victims: Julie Doe, Dennis Doe, and Christmas Doe. All the cases were cold, and as of this week, 2 of those 3 victims we've featured have been identified. What's more, their alleged killers have been too. We've already talked to you about the identification of Dennis Doe as William Deshaun Hamilton. You can check out our update on the case for that information. But now we can also share that the 1988 case of Christmas Jane Doe has been resolved too. As of November 13th, 2023, she was identified as Kenyatta Kiki Odom. Kenyatta, who was from Albany, Georgia, was just 5 years old when she was murdered. According to a recent press conference held by multiple law enforcement agencies, her mother, Evelyn Odom, and her mother's then-boyfriend, Ulysses Sanders, have been charged with felony murder, cruelty to children in the first degree, aggravated battery, family violence, concealing the death of another person, and conspiracy to conceal the death of another person. Based on information that's been released by the GBI so far, it seems that though law enforcement did pursue forensic investigative genetic genealogy as far back as 2019, that avenue did not directly lead to Kenyatta's identification. They did get indication that her family was from Albany, which backed up a clue already present in her case. When her remains were discovered in Ware County, Georgia, back in 1988, there was an Albany, Georgia newspaper found at the recovery scene, and investigators had long suspected that connection. When a local Albany TV news station ran an anniversary story on her cold case in December of 2022, a resident saw the forensic reconstruction of Christmas Doe, and that resident called authorities. And that resident provided enough information to allow investigators to make the connections they needed. And finally, this fall, Kenyatta's identity was confirmed. It's so important to share cold cases on multiple platforms to reach as many people as possible. Not everyone uses social media. That's why physical newspapers are important, and TV news stories, and those flyers that still circulate in the mail. And though the GBI has not identified the person who helped solve Kenyatta's case, based on what they indicated, it was a very similar story to William Deshaun Hamilton's. Kenyatta's mother told people that she'd gone to live with her father, but with someone, it never sat quite right. And that is where you and everyone else who cares about cold cases comes in. When you share on social media or reach out to your local news station and ask them to cover a case, it is not a useless gesture. This case resolution proves that. Information gets in front of the right person, and no case is hopeless. Even the most difficult unidentified person's cases can be resolved, whether the files are thin or very few remains are left or the decedent's remains aren't available at all. It just takes the right piece of information in front of the right person. That point was proven in another way with one of the 22 files we began with this season. That communication is often how mysteries are solved. In fact, it's how, while we were still working on this series, the case of skeletal remains found in a basement on Meharry Boulevard in Nashville back in 1984 was closed. Detective Matthew Filter had only recently inherited that file, and it was a thin one. We managed to dig up a little more in terms of news coverage from the time. According to Metro Nashville PD files, this all unfolded at a home on Meharry Boulevard, which is close to Meharry Medical College. There's not a lot known about the home. All Detective Filter could tell us was what the previous case detective reported back in 1984. Essentially, we know that the owner of the home had inherited the property through family and that it was built back in 1890. According to police reports, the owner had not been living in the home. It had long been a rental. She actually rented it out to medical students quite often, but it was vacant back in November of 1984. So, that was a good time for the owner to do some repairs on the home. On November 29, 1984, an electrician went under the vacant home's crawl space. He was there for a pretty extensive rewiring job, and he had to go back further than any previous repairman likely had, at least in recent years. When he got a ways under, he saw what appeared to be a human bone, a leg bone, as he described it. Of course, law enforcement was called, and when the responding officer checked, he identified a femur in the crawl space. Soon, there was a team on scene, and after an extensive search, they'd recovered a number of skeletal remains, most of which had been placed under a burlap sack. When the remains were brought out and examined, roughly half a skeleton had been recovered, of what seemed to be, at first, the remains of a fairly large male. There was no skull. According to the Tennessean, the officers who arrived on scene had rather unique experience. They had just been through a training course with Dr. Bill Bass, who was at the time one of the most renowned experts in forensic anthropology in the country. So, when they spoke to the Tennessean at the time, they were easily able to identify the bones that were recovered, including a pelvis, a femur, a tibia, and a few others, and they noted the importance of getting an anthropological examination done as quickly as possible. So, it seemed strange to us that there was not a skeletal report included in the file, but we don't always get to see everything. Those files can be kept with a medical examiner, for instance. In this case, though, finding out about and tracking down that anthropological report was vital because it ended up closing the case. When we spoke with a state expert regarding the 1984 Meharry case, they were able to do research and track down papers that, while on file, had perhaps been separated from Metro Nashville PD's internal files. And it turned out that back in 1984, a forensic anthropologist had deduced that the skeletal remains did not belong to the same individual. In fact, they belonged to multiple individuals. And the remains showed the telltale markings and wear patterns that made it clear that they were medical specimens used for teaching in labs and classrooms. There had not been a murder at Meharry Boulevard, but human remains had been misused. After some investigation, it had come to light that medical students had rented the Meharry Boulevard house for some time, and that the bones underneath the home were specimens that had been improperly brought home from the lab or other teaching areas of the school. The reconnection of these two files meant that the case could be closed, and that investigative resources could be redirected to forensic cases. We wanted to tell this story because, unfortunately, it's more common than you might think. Human remains retained for scientific purposes end up out in the world, and without any information to go along with them, they may be labeled as forensic cases. This does not discount that some human remains in medical and museum spaces may in fact be historical forensic cases. That's a separate issue, but the mishandling of scientific specimens can lead to investigations for law enforcement, forensic investigative genetic genealogy, and resources spent. Yet another reason why the role of forensic anthropologists is so important. The other cases we're covering this episode can't be closed that easily. In fact, the next three are some of the most difficult for medical legal experts to resolve. They are what's called single-element cases. That's a term used to describe when a single element or a bone from a skeleton is found. Now, technically, the skull is called a single element, although it's made up of two elements, the cranium and the mandible. The fewer bones found, the more difficult the case. On May 31st, 1987, fishermen on the Cumberland River came upon a human cranium, drifting up against a small embankment. According to Metro Nashville PD files, they'd been fishing along the river near the Cajun's Wharf restaurant when they saw what looked like part of a skull washing up against the bank of a little island in the river. Per police files, quote, "They thought about leaving it and calling police, but were afraid it would wash away before they returned." The fishermen carefully retrieved the cranium and checked the island area and water for any other bones, then returned to land so they could call police. According to initial reports, the skeletal remains appeared to be, quote, deteriorated, but the upper teeth were intact, and some hair remained. When authorities returned to the area to continue the search, they were not able to discover any further signs of the victim's remains. Based on a forensic examination, it's estimated that the victim was a black male, possibly in his 20s, though age is difficult to determine, and that he'd likely been dead for 4 to 8 months. So, if he'd gone missing in the Nashville area, he might have disappeared anywhere between 1986 and early 1987. As you can imagine, that's almost nothing to go on in 1988, much less when you pick up a case almost 40 years later. Missing persons reports are a start, though, especially when we begin with Nashville locals, as we're doing now. But forensic investigative genetic genealogy will be the best bet for his identity and his loved ones, unless the right tip comes through. Because in this case, there's not even a static recovery scene, and that's because the victim was found in the water. He could have died or been dumped quite a distance away from where he was found, and it makes the investigation even more difficult for the Cajun's Wharf John Doe. A similar situation is the case of the Antioch Jane Doe. Back in March of 1991, residents in Antioch called Metro Nashville PD. According to police reports, they'd come home and let their small dog out to play in the backyard, a backyard which bordered a wooded area. When the dog was called to come inside, it ran back from the forest with something in its mouth. When one of the residents went closer to examine, he realized that the dog had a human cranium. There was no mandible. Of course, the homeowners had no further information to give police. They had no idea where precisely their dog had been, just somewhere in that wooded area. A search began that day and continued into the next, but officers were unable to recover any further remains, or even discover precisely where the dog had found the cranium. If it had dug or otherwise unearthed the victim, there were no signs. There was a graveyard not far from the home, but per police, quote, nothing had been disturbed. Metro Nashville then began 2 separate lines of inquiry: research into possible missing persons in the area, and an examination of the victim by Dr. Bill Bass and his team. According to Metro Nashville records, after examination, the decedent was declared most likely a white or Hispanic Latino female, likely between 30 to 50 years of age, and most likely between 30 and 40. When better DNA technology developed, the decedent's DNA was entered into CODIS. And since Detective Filter has been on the case, he's identified 2 possible missing persons to be compared with the victim. Both women, Linda Carol Taylor and Jennifer Wyant, were compared and ruled out as matches. No cause of death has been determined for the Antioch Jane Doe, and the Metro Nashville PD are still seeking tips and comparisons in her case. It's likely that she died at least 18 months before her discovery. There's a road in West Nashville called Pecan Valley. It runs off Highway 12 in what Detective Filter tells us is a rural area of Davidson County. Back in December of 2010, a hunter was walking through a wooded area just off Pecan Valley Road, about 30 or 40 yards down an embankment, but still in sight of the road itself. There, down the embankment, he discovered a partial human skull. According to Metro Nashville reports, the hunter searched around, but he didn't see any other signs of skeletal remains. At that point, the hunter decided to transport the cranium back to his father's home instead of leaving the victim's remains at the scene. His father immediately called law enforcement, who asked the young hunter to lead them back to the recovery scene. Though they conducted a search, they did not discover any further remains, and the hunter advised them that the area had flooded just 7 months ago. The victim was taken to be examined by state forensic anthropologists. There was so much mud, likely from those floods, that the anthropologists had difficulty examining the victim's fine dental work, what remained of it, but they could say that he was a male. Initially, he was estimated to be a male of likely European descent and at least 20 years of age. Based on bone weathering, it was estimated that he'd been dead for years. How many, though, it was difficult to precisely estimate. No cause of death could be determined, and we could not find any missing persons comparisons in the file. And then, there was no movement. Not for a decade. Not until recently. Since Othram Labs began work on the Pecan Valley Doe case last year, important new information has come to light. Since the DNA profile was successfully developed, Detective Filter tells us that the Pecan Valley John Doe's ancestry estimation has been updated. According to DNA results, he is primarily of African ancestry and not European, as the anthropological estimation originally noted. And genealogists have made advancements in tracing his familial roots. According to Detective Filter's most recent report, the Pecan Valley John Doe has family from Kansas City, Missouri, and St. Paul, Minnesota. His family in Missouri has the surnames of Robinson and Henderson, and in Minnesota, the surname of Anthony. These leads are particularly important, especially because we have no sense of how the Pecan Valley John Doe may have died, or how he came to be in Tennessee. He very well could be a missing person reported in Missouri or Minnesota, and that report could predate 2010 by years. When we spoke with Detective Filter about the Tennessee Doe cases, I asked him a few specific questions about single-element cases, both regarding difficulty and the problems that come up with unclear recovery scenes. We talked about what people should do if they come upon bones, because that happens. Hikers, runners, hunters, campers, anyone out in nature might stumble upon a potential recovery scene. When there's no crime scene or clear recovery scene, what extra obstacles do you face as a detective?
You really face every conceivable obstacle. Besides not knowing who this person is, you don't know where the rest of them is. And in these cases, your skull is mobile. And so, with the exception of Pecan Valley, we don't know where the skull originally was. So, you only have the skull to work with, and you have to learn what you can from it and expand your investigation from there.
In terms of getting media interest or coverage for these cases, do you have any issues or trouble getting coverage for single element cases?
They don't generally get a lot of attention because there isn't a lot to tell. Once you're able to learn as much as possible about the skull or bone and can at least make some kind of a story out of it, the news media will usually grab onto it. Social media usually does better and sparks more conversation, but not necessarily constructive or helpful conversation.
Can you talk a little bit about how you go about investigating a single element case? Is there much you can do besides checking for open missing persons in the area and comparing dentals? Are there other techniques that you employ?
Checking for missing persons that were last known to be in the area and dental records are the most immediate things to do. If I have enough of a skull to work with, a forensic rendering can potentially be done, and anthropology analysis can help narrow the search field. DNA is usually our best friend with cases like this.
This is something that I don't think people often consider, but let's go ahead and get it stated very clearly. Please tell our audience what they should do if they see what they think may be human remains. Anywhere, but I imagine it would most likely be the woods or a rural area. What should they do, and what should they absolutely not do?
Take a look around and make a good mental note of where the remains are. Then contact your local law enforcement agency and report what you found. Take them to the remains if you can provide them with any information that might be helpful in determining who the person is. What you should absolutely not do is touch the remains. This includes going through clothing pockets or otherwise manipulating anything on or around the remains. As discussed previously, law enforcement treats all deaths as though they are homicides until proven otherwise. So think of it as if you just walked up on a freshly murdered body. You wouldn't want to touch it out of fear of contaminating any evidence. So is the same with any remains that have obviously been there for a while. Even if the person has been lying in the elements for years, critical pieces of evidence can still be obtained.
Because in a lot of these cases we're discussing, people did disturb sites, pick up human remains, take them home, bring them to law enforcement, move them, see them years earlier, and then report them, right? And that, of course, made cases much more difficult.
Yeah. Leave them be and immediately report what you found. Unless you have a situation kind of like the City Island skull that was found, where there was likely potential that by the time they left to find somebody and bring them back, it could have been washed away. If they're comfortable with picking it up to make sure it doesn't go anywhere, I don't think anybody would ever fault them for that. But in most cases where, say, they're walking through the woods or something and they come across a skull or some remains, if they can just make a good note as to where they are and contact law enforcement immediately and then bring them back to the location.
Though the last 3 cases were found without any clues to aid in identification, the next case is perhaps made more confusing by the items discovered with the victim's remains. This is not a single element case, but the clues found with the victim, which felt like strong leads, at least at first, proved to be frustratingly elusive. On December 29, 2001, contractors working near the Metro Nashville International Airport came upon a human skull. The victim's skull was found near a creek behind the airport, and when Metro Nashville PD commenced their search, they soon found further skeletal remains. There was no sign of an encampment in the area. They did find a pair of men's jeans, men's size 11 Skechers boots, and a brown billfold or wallet containing a Kroger Plus card, an Allstate policy insurance card, and a photograph. The victim showed no clear signs of trauma, and when further anthropological examination was done, the experts were not able to determine cause of death. They were, though, able to provide further information on the victim. It's estimated that the victim was a Native American male, 35 to 58 years old, and between 5'6" and 6 feet tall. According to skeletal analysis, it's estimated that the Century Boulevard John Doe was deceased for 6 months to 3 years before he was found. His teeth showed no sign of dental work. The biggest clue, of course, were those cards that were found with the victim. We don't have a description of the photograph, but the cards are exactly the kind of item that we think of as tied to our identities, digital records of our purchases, or even better, insurance tied to our names or our social security numbers. But when Detective Filter tried to research those items, he ran into issues.
When I tried to research them, the card information was so old the info had been purged. The detectives' reports didn't specify why they were unable to get any information from the cards, but it's possible that they ran into the same issue.
So they were just really old?
Well, I know it probably in my case, when I went back to it, it'd been so long, probably since they had been issued, that I wasn't able to get the information on it anymore. Like with the Kroger Plus card, I think they told me that if you don't use that card, that your information gets purged after 6 months, something like that. So, it could have been a card that he got within the year and the information just got purged that quickly.
There is some good news, though. Unlike many skeletal cases we've encountered in Tennessee, there's forensic art in the Century Boulevard John Doe's case, which we've included on the flyer that we've made for him. And he is in line for forensic investigative genetic genealogy, but that is pending funding. So again, we're asking you to look at missing persons cases that may be a possible match. Like the Antioch John Doe from episode 2 of this series, the Century Boulevard John Doe's case would fall into the category of MMIP, missing and murdered Indigenous persons, assuming that his ancestry estimation is correct. He may have disappeared or lost contact with loved ones somewhere between 1998 and 2000, though that range is approximate. And remember, he could be from anywhere. If you love research, spending time in NamUs or on Doe Network, or looking for cases that could match, that is a huge public service. Currently, there are no exclusions listed for him on NamUs, but his DNA is available in CODIS for comparison, and dental information is also available for any possible match comparisons. The last case we're covering this season is the one that we've been working on for the longest time. Behind the scenes, we've been studying every aspect of the River Road John Doe's case for more than 6 months. In fact, we've been trying to help solve it. We've gotten somewhere with our work, but not nearly far enough. We will keep trying for as long as it takes, beyond this season. And more than anything, we want you to help us. This goes beyond a share or a social media post. We think it's going to take as many eyes and ideas as possible to reconnect this individual with his identity. You see, the River Road John Doe's remains are no longer available, which means DNA testing is not an option. Neither is skeletal reanalysis. The evidence, that's gone too, though we do have pictures. The paper trail simply is not there. There have been extensive attempts to locate everything, but so far, it's been unsuccessful. But we know that a case can be solved with records, with information, and with the right clues. And we do have some decent clues and some decent ideas. But we're not there yet. So, if there's a real chance to reconnect him with his identity and his loved ones, we need your good ideas too. This is an old case from 1988, but we've seen 2 1988 Doe cases resolved this fall. So, it can be done. Let's set the scene. Yet another corner of Nashville. We've been all over the map by now, and this time we're down by River Road, an area that Detective Filter is familiar with.
The River Road area is on the west side of Nashville. The particular area where these remains were found was near a building materials company. The company owns a large tract of land on the Cumberland River, and much of the land is wooded.
On May 11th, 1988, 2 fishermen were walking down River Road toward a creek. According to the Tennessean, they headed down a gravel path, run over with weeds, and not too far from a local baseball field. It was there, a little ways down the path, that the fishermen saw human remains lying in the grass. Based on early reports, the fishermen described the fully clothed, badly decomposed remains of what appeared to be a man. Early investigators on the scene told the Tennessean that, quote, the body appeared to have been there for at least a month. The paper indicated that an autopsy was scheduled for May 12th. We never found a copy of that autopsy report, and neither has Detective Filter. But the estimate of the victim's PMI, or postmortem interval, was expanded to perhaps as early as November of 1987. We think that estimate is unlikely for a few reasons, but we'll get to that in a moment. First, we need to discuss why a body might have been found there at all. As Detective Filter mentioned, there wasn't much out there besides Rural County and a materials company. He discussed this further with Brooke.
You might wonder if a person who went back there was either familiar with it because they had been to that business, or maybe they had spent, their time as a young person hanging out in those woods.
Yeah, any of that is possible. There isn't a lot of information in the case file, and although it was on private land, it's not uncommon for homeless camps to be located on privately owned land, especially if it's a section of property that the landowners rarely go into. So there isn't any mention in the case file, and I can't say whether or not the officers or detectives that investigated this looked around the area for a camp or inquired about a homeless camp in the area. But it was a very, very desolate kind of area. Definitely not a high traffic area where this person was found. He was just kind of off on the side of a service road that the company used, and he was found in some tall grass. So it's very possible that he just had a medical episode and walked off the road or something and just died. And because of the vegetation in the area, nobody ever saw him laying there.
There was no clear cause of death, no trauma, and no reason that Metro Nashville could figure that the man was in the area. Though he may have been unhoused, there are a few details that make that theory complicated. Although we do not have a copy of the autopsy, we do have preliminary examination notes, a description of the decedent's clothing, and further details from the scene, that and a detailed dental chart. According to Metro Nashville's files, the victim was estimated to be a 25 to 35-year-old male, about 5'8", with straight dark hair. The report describes him as white, but there's no indication that an anthropological report was completed, and because the decedent was found with mummified skin covering his skeletal remains, it might be wise to consider men of other races too. Perhaps most distinctively, he had extensive, expensive dental work, crowns, fillings, and 2 capped front teeth, metal with porcelain on top. He wore a gray jacket with a zipper, a blue pinstripe white shirt, green fatigue pants, brown penny loafer shoes, a black Casio watch, and a gold medal ring with a, quote, Trojan warrior head embossed in blue. He wore both the ring and the watch on his right hand. Regarding the ring, the word embossed may be inexact, though it's difficult to tell from the photos, which are blurry. It's equally likely that the stone is engraved, perhaps on hematite that look bluish, or on a similar stone. After studying both class and signet-style rings, we consulted with a friend of the show who connected us with a vintage jewelry expert. She felt it was most likely that the ring was a signet style versus a class ring, and told us that the particular type was popular in 2 different eras, the 1920s and the 1970s. Considering the time frame of this case, the latter seems more likely. The Trojan design, a warrior's head, that could also be a Spartan or a centurion. It's a large ring, and though popular in style, we think that a family member would recognize it. The victim's Casio watch is important too, though for different reasons. Because, according to police reports, it was telling the correct time. Daylight savings time had just begun that April, about 5 weeks before the River Road John Doe was discovered. And it's worth noting that in 1988, his watch would have had to be manually adjusted for all time changes. We discussed all of these details with Detective Filter. Based on the ring and watch being on his right hand and wrist, do you think it's safe to assume that the victim was left-handed?
I think that's a good possibility worth noting, but I wouldn't limit my search to only left-handed people.
We don't have any pictures of the watch, but do you think we could use that time frame, the setting of the watch, to help us narrow down when someone might have gone missing?
Absolutely. That would be a good reference if the watch is still running.
And the watch was still running, which means it certainly could give us a more specific PMI. Of course, a watch could conceivably run for a year and thus be correct again at the time a victim was found. But the River Road John Doe was found still inside his clothes, with almost no animal predation or insect activity. And though one PMI offered to set the possible time of death as early as November of 1987, a pathologist that we consulted suggested a time of death closer to 3 weeks to a month. She pointed out the fact that no predators had disturbed the victim's remains or removed bones from the scene. And she also mentioned that the victim's skin had mummified but was still intact. That is fairly unusual in the South, particularly in a wilderness environment. But it had been markedly dry that April and May in Nashville, and hot. It was the right environment for mummification. So, it's very possible that the River Road John Doe died just after April 4th, 1988, enough time for his watch to have been adjusted. It's not certain, and we looked at missing persons whose disappearance dates fell outside that narrow range, but it seems like a good starting point. We also asked Detective Filter about other distinctive features he thinks are particularly important to consider when looking at missing persons cases, and if there are any notes from the original report where, perhaps, we should widen our search. In terms of his dental chart, he seems to have had significant dental work. What do you consider to be the most unique?
I think the cap front teeth would be the most notable to people in general. But without an anthropologist report to look at for specific findings, I would not eliminate anyone out of consideration. I would consider a wide age range, and any race would be a consideration.
So, that's what we've been doing these past months. We've been searching NamUs and every other missing persons website, so far concentrating on 1987 and 1988, though of course a missing person may have disappeared long before the discovery date. Detective Filter does have detailed dental charts to use for possible comparisons, that and the description of the River Road John Doe's clothing and his general physical description. But even with a list of possible matches, in NamUs and the Charlie Project, it was not enough. We moved to newspaper archives and personal ads mentioning missing loved ones, and to web forums. We posted ads featuring a similar ring on social media and boosted those ads so they appeared in Tennessee and surrounding states, with titles like, "Do you recognize this ring?" The results were more names for Detective Filter to cross-check. Still, though, we felt like there was more we could do. So we called Victor Veldstra, who you've heard from on the show before. He's a member of the Trans Doe Task Force and heads up LAMP, their database designed to track the cases of missing persons in the LGBTQ+ community. And more than that, Victor is an expert in missing persons cases. He's solved or helped solve a number of cases over the years, and we thought that he might have some ideas. And we were right. Victor pointed out two instances when people often are not reported missing. First, armed service members who were absent without leave, or AWOL, and second, people with active warrants who police were seeking at the time or around the time they may have disappeared. There are various branches of the military, of course, and getting through everything is going to take a while. But so far, we found the Army's official AWOL list, updated as of 2021. It's archived, but it has the information we need. A list of men who were AWOL in 1987 and 1988. We were able to exclude several men based on current public records activity or on death. But the others, particularly those with ties to the South, they went on the list. Detective Filter was also able to get a list of men with active warrants within the same time period. Only felonies were still on file, but those 30 records are what we're working on now, cross-checking, seeking death dates, looking for activity, looking for social media posts from family or friends who still might be searching. This is certainly not a law enforcement effort designed to arrest anyone. Our only goal is to find a match for the River Road John Doe, if we can. And those roads may take us nowhere, but they could lead to an answer. And you may have ideas too. So, if you have ever wanted the chance to help solve a cold case, this is truly it. We've shared everything we know of you here, and we will repeat it at the end of the episode, and you can find the flyers on our social media. We do want to caution, though, we encourage responsible research. That means non-invasive study of what's been publicly shared about the case. The most important rule is you should never contact a family or a friend of a missing person, ever. We have seen the damage that does. So, if you think you found a possible match for the River Road John Doe, just call or email Metro Nashville PD and share what you know. If you prefer, you can also reach out to us and we will pass that information along. If the missing person is listed in NamUs or on the Doe Network, you can contact their regional director listed on the page. Or, if any of this information sounds familiar, if you have a tip, call Metro Nashville PD. Here are the cases we discussed today. The Cajun's Wharf John Doe was a black male, possibly in his 20s. At the time of discovery, in 1987, he'd likely been dead for approximately 4 to 8 months. The Antioch Jane Doe, who was discovered in 1991, was likely a white or Hispanic or Latino female, between 30 and 50 years of age. The Pecan Valley John Doe, found in 2010, was a black male of at least 20 years of age. He had family from Kansas City, Missouri, and St. Paul, Minnesota. His family in Missouri have the surnames of Robinson and Henderson, and in Minnesota, the surname of Anthony. The Century Boulevard John Doe was likely a Native American male, 35 to 58 years old, and between 5'6" and 6 feet tall. His remains were discovered in 2001, and he wore jeans and Skechers boots. The River Road John Doe was discovered in 1988 and estimated to be between 25 and 35 years old. He's about 5'8" with dark hair. He wore a gray jacket with a zipper, a blue pinstriped white shirt, green fatigue pants, brown penny loafer shoes, a black Casio watch, and a gold medal ring with a, quote, Trojan warrior head embossed in blue. He wore both the ring and watch on his right hand. He had capped front teeth. If you have any information, please contact Detective Filter at Metro Nashville Police at 615-862-7803. You can also call Nashville Crime Stoppers at 615-74-CRIME or 7463. Callers may remain anonymous and may qualify for a cash reward. Next time on The Fall Line, we're speaking with experts who you know well about a subject that's come up a lot this season, forensic investigative genetic genealogy, and how they've used it to solve many cases, including the one featured in my book. Special thanks this episode to Victor Veltstra for his valuable consultation and to Aaron Rudy. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independently produced show, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIAs, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. And if you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And take a moment to rate and review our show on your podcast app of choice. My book, Lay Them to Rest, which covers years of my life working on a Jane Doe case and the world of forensic scientists who resolve unidentified persons cases, is out everywhere now as hardcover, ebook, and audiobook, read by me. You can order it anywhere you get books and through your local library. Find out more through the link in our show notes. And if you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us on Patreon or Apple Premium. 100% of our Patreon and Apple Premium earnings are supporting our Family Therapy Fund and actively paying for therapy for families who've appeared on the show. On Patreon, you can get early release, ad-free versions of our regular episodes for $5 a month. Or if you prefer Apple Premium, you can subscribe there as well. On Patreon, we also post occasional giveaways, updates, and blogs, which all patrons can enjoy, starting at just $1. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laurah Norton, with additional research assistance from Brian Warders and Anna Luria. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Produced, engineered, and scored by Maura Curry. Content advisement by Brandy C. Williams. And, as always, our most special thanks to Liz Lipka.